The alarm did not sound like a warning. It sounded like the end of a very long, very comfortable dream. I was standing at the edge of the council floor when the lights above the great chamber snapped from their usual soft gold into a hard, flickering white. Every delegate in that circular hall rose from their seats at once, 1,000 different bodies moving in 1,000 different ways, and for one breath there was no sound at all. Then came the noise, claws on marble, wings snapping open, voices in a dozen languages asking the same question in a dozen different pitches. One ship had crossed into council space. Not a fleet, not a formation, one ship. I remember thinking that was the strangest part of all. In 300 years of service to the Assembly, I had never seen a single vessel trigger a chamber-wide alert. Fleets triggered alerts. Armadas triggered alerts. A lone ship should have been a formality, a blip on a screen, something a junior officer mentioned in a routine report over breakfast. Instead, half the council was on its feet, and the other half was already shouting for the doors to be sealed. I am Daniel Hart. At the time all of this began, I held no rank that meant anything to the beings in that chamber. I was, as far as their translators could explain it, a courier, a messenger sent ahead of a ship that should not have been able to reach them so quickly, carrying words they were not prepared to hear. I did not know, standing there in the corridor outside the chamber with my escort of 2 very nervous council guards on either side of me, that I was about to become the single most discussed being in galactic history. I only knew that my orders were simple. Walk in, listen to their demands, give them an answer, leave. The doors ahead of me were 40 feet tall, carved from some pale stone that had been quarried, according to the guide who met my shuttle, from the founding world of the Assembly itself. Symbols of 100-member species circled the frame in layered rings, each one representing a voice that had, at some point in the last 1,000 years, been given a seat at that table. There was no ring for humanity. Not yet. The guard on my left, a tall insectoid being with faceted eyes that caught the light in fractured patterns, turned to me as we approached the doors. You understand, she said, her translator device buzzing faintly with each word, that what happens in this chamber will decide the fate of your species. I looked at her for a moment. I was not unkind. I had no reason to be unkind to her. She was doing her job, and in her position, doing her job meant trying to prepare a stranger for what she believed was about to be a very short, very final conversation. I understand, I told her. I just don't think it's going to go the way you expect. She did not answer. The doors began to open. The chamber beyond was larger than anything I had stood inside before. Tiered seating rose in concentric rings toward a ceiling so high it vanished into shadow, and every seat was occupied. There were beings with skin like polished stone, beings with too many limbs, beings that seemed to be made of something closer to smoke than flesh, all of them watching the same small opening in the floor where I now stood. At the center of the chamber, on a raised platform surrounded by a ring of soft blue light, sat the presiding officer of the council. Her name, I would later learn, was Vireth Sol, and she had held that position for longer than most of the species in that room had records of their own history. She did not stand when I entered. She simply watched, her long, pale fingers folded in front of her, waiting. I walked forward. My footsteps echoed in a way that made it clear the architects of this place had designed it to make anyone standing where I stood feel very, very small. It did not work the way they intended. Envoy of the species designated Terran, Vireth Sol said, and her voice carried through the chamber without any visible effort on her part, amplified by some system built into the platform itself. You stand before the Galactic Council to answer for the unauthorized expansion of your species beyond its home system. Do you understand the charges brought against you? I stopped at the base of the platform. I did not kneel. I did not bow. I simply stood, hands loose at my sides, and looked up at her. I understand what you've said, I told her. I don't understand why you think it's a charge. A murmur ran through the tiered seats above me, a sound like wind moving through dry branches. I could not tell if it was amusement or outrage. Perhaps it was both. Vireth Sol's expression did not change. Your species has, in the span of less than 2 of your own centuries, expanded from a single world to claim territory across 11 star systems. This expansion occurred without submission to this council, without tribute offered to the species whose space you border. and without any request for the recognition that every other member of this assembly sought before taking a single step beyond their home system. We didn't know we needed permission, I said. Every species requires permission, she said. That is the foundation upon which peace in this galaxy has been built for 1,000 years. Every world that exists within Council space exists because its expansion was granted, negotiated, and bound by treaty. Yours is the only species in recorded history to have simply taken what it wanted. I let that sit in the air for a moment. Around the chamber, delegates leaned forward in their seats, waiting to see how the small, unarmed creature at the base of the platform would respond to being called a thief in front of 1,000 witnesses. We didn't take anything that belonged to anyone else, I said. We expanded into empty space. Systems with no inhabitants, no claims, no flags planted by anyone but us. If that's a crime here, then I'd like someone to explain to me who exactly we stole it from. The principle, Vireth Sol said, is not about ownership of the systems themselves. It is about respect for the order that keeps this galaxy from tearing itself apart. 1,000 years ago, before this council existed, expansion was unregulated, and it led to conflicts that erased entire civilizations from existence. The rules exist to prevent that from happening again. Your species broke those rules before you even knew they existed, and now you stand here, still refusing to acknowledge that you have done anything wrong. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the men and women who had died carving those 11 systems out of hostile space, with nothing but their own hands and their own will, decades before anyone from this council had bothered to send a single scout to see what humanity was doing. I thought about how strange it was to be told, by beings who had never once reached out to offer guidance, welcome, or warning, that we had somehow wronged them simply by surviving. I hear you, I said finally. I understand that you have rules, and that we didn't follow them. What I don't understand is why that means we owe you something now. Vireth Sol's fingers tightened slightly where they were folded in front of her. It was such a small gesture that I doubted anyone but the beings closest to the platform noticed it. I noticed it. I had spent a long time learning to read the things people did not want me to see. The council has prepared terms, she said. You will hear them now, and you will respond with your species' formal acceptance. A panel near the platform lit up, and a long list of demands began to scroll across it in a script I could not read, though a translation feed activated somewhere near my ear a moment later, rendering the words into something I understood. Territorial concession of 7 of the 11 claimed systems, to be redistributed among neighboring species as compensation for the disruption caused by unauthorized settlement. Tribute, to be paid annually, in resources and technology, to the Council Treasury, as restitution for the violation of expansion protocol. Disarmament of all military vessels beyond what the Council deemed necessary for basic system defense, with all remaining ships subject to inspection. Permanent Council oversight of any future expansion, with all decisions subject to a vote, in which humanity would hold no seat, no voice, and no veto. I read through the list twice, listening to the translation feed repeat each demand in a calm, measured voice that made the words sound almost reasonable, almost like something a person could simply agree to if they were tired enough, or frightened enough, or alone enough. I was not tired, I was not frightened, and I was not, whatever the chamber believed, alone. That's everything? I asked. That is the full extent of the Council's terms, Vireth Sol said. You have been granted the honor of responding on behalf of your entire species. I would advise you to consider your answer carefully. No species in the history of this council has refused terms presented in this chamber. I looked around the room one more time. I looked at the 1,000 faces watching me, waiting for the small, unarmed creature from the unregistered species to do what every other species before it had done. Bow its head, accept the terms, beg, if it had to, for mercy it did not know it needed to ask for. Somewhere far above the atmosphere of that world, in the black silence of space, a single human warship sat holding its position exactly where I had left it, its crew watching the same feed I was standing inside of, waiting for a word from me that would tell them what to do next. I thought about my orders. I thought about the years of history that had led to this exact moment, the decades of quiet expansion, The sacrifices made by people who would never know their names were about to become the reason an entire galaxy changed the way it understood itself. I looked back at Virith Sol. "No," I said. The word did not echo the way my footsteps had. It did not need to. It landed in that chamber like a stone dropped into still water, and I watched the ripples spread outward across 1,000 unfamiliar faces, each one turning toward its neighbor in something between disbelief and fury. Virith Sol did not move. For a long moment, she simply looked at me, as though she were waiting for the translation feed to correct some obvious error in what it had rendered. "You refuse the terms," she said slowly, as if testing whether the words made any more sense spoken aloud. "I refuse the terms," I said. "All of them." The chamber erupted. Sound broke over the chamber in a wave. Delegates surged to their feet, voices layering over one another in a chaos of languages that no translator could untangle fast enough. Somewhere above me, a being with a voice like grinding stone was shouting something that made 3 of his neighbors recoil. Elsewhere, a delegate covered in shifting patterns of light flickered so violently that the beings around her had to shield their eyes. I stood very still at the base of the platform and let it happen. Virith Sol raised one hand, and a low tone sounded through the chamber, a signal I did not understand but that every delegate clearly did. The noise did not stop immediately, but it thinned, dropping from a roar to something closer to a simmer, hundreds of voices still murmuring even as the chamber's presiding officer rose from her seat for the first time since I had entered. "You understand what you have just done," she said, and for the first time, there was something in her voice that was not quite calm. "No species has ever refused council terms, not once, in 1,000 years. I understood that before I said it," I told her. "Then you understand that the consequences of this refusal will not be small. I understand that you think they won't be." A new voice cut through the chamber before Virith Sol could respond. It came from one of the lower tiers, closer to the platform than most of the seats, and belonged to a delegate I had not yet had reason to notice. He was broad, plated in something that looked like layered bronze scale, with eyes set deep beneath a heavy brow that gave him a permanent look of suspicion. I would come to know him, in the days that followed, as Corin Dasa, senior delegate of the Thren Compact, and one of the loudest voices for immediate action against any species foolish enough to test the Council's patience. "This is not a negotiation any longer," Corin said, rising to his feet. "This is defiance." Open, deliberate defiance, delivered by a single unarmed creature standing where 1,000 others have knelt. I move that the Council treat this refusal as an act of aggression, and respond accordingly. The chamber's murmur rose again, sharper this time, threaded with agreement from some quarters and open alarm from others. I watched the room divide in real time, the way water divides around a stone dropped into its center, and I understood that whatever happened next in this chamber, it would not be decided by me. It would be decided by beings who had spent centuries deciding what fear should look like, now trying to decide whether the strange, calm creature in front of them deserved it. "You call this defiance," I said, loud enough that the translation feed carried it clearly across the chamber. "But no one in this room has asked me why we refused. You assumed the answer would be surrender, and when it wasn't, you decided the only explanation left was hostility. That says more about how this council has operated for 1,000 years than it does about my species." "Explain yourself then," Virith Sol said, and there was an edge in the words now, something sharper than the calm authority she had carried a few moments earlier. "If your refusal is not defiance, then what is it?" I looked around the chamber one more time before I answered. I looked at the 1,000 faces, some furious, some frightened, some simply curious, in the way that beings are curious about something they have never seen before, and do not yet know how to categorize. "It's honesty," I said. "You asked us to give up territory we settled through our own effort, without a single council world ever offering to help us survive out there. You asked us to pay tribute for the crime of existing somewhere you hadn't already claimed. You asked us to disarm, in a galaxy where every other species keeps a fleet at the ready in case its neighbor decides the treaty isn't worth the ink it was written with. And you asked us to accept oversight from a body that has never once asked what we needed, only what we owed." I let the words settle before I continued. "We refused because agreeing to those terms would not have bought us peace. It would have bought us a slower version of exactly what you're threatening us with right now. we would have surrendered our territory, our resources, and our right to defend ourselves, and in exchange, we would have received nothing but the temporary illusion that this council had decided, for now, to let us live.
I didn't come here to buy that illusion.
I came here to tell you the truth, which is that my species has no intention of trading its future for your patience. For a long moment, no one in the chamber spoke. It was Vireth Sol who finally broke the silence, and when she did, her voice had lost the last of its careful calm. You speak of truth as though it grants you some form of protection. It does not. This council did not survive 1,000 years by allowing single species to decide, on their own authority, which laws applied to them and which did not. If we permit your refusal to stand unanswered, every species watching this proceeding will learn the same lesson, and the order that keeps this galaxy from collapsing into endless conflict will collapse with it. Then maybe the order was never as strong as you believed, I said. An order that only holds because everyone is too afraid to test it isn't order. It's fear, wearing order's clothes. Korin Dasa was on his feet again, his voice booming across the chamber before Vireth Sol could respond. Enough philosophy. This creature has given its answer. Let the council give ours. I call for an immediate vote on military response, effective the moment this session ends.
You would move to war,
Came another voice, calmer, from higher in the tiers. Over the words of a single envoy who arrived on this world entirely alone, in a ship your own sensors could not fully classify? Has it occurred to you, Korin, that a species capable of sending a single vessel into contested space without hesitation might have reasons for that confidence beyond simple arrogance? I turned toward the new voice and found a delegate I had not yet spoken with, seated several tiers up, dressed in robes the color of deep water, her 4 eyes fixed not on me, but on Korin Dasa, with an expression that made it very clear this was not the first disagreement the two of them had ever had. Her name, I would learn, was Ambassador Sela Tovan, and in the days that followed, she would become one of the very few voices in that chamber willing to say aloud what most of the others were only beginning to suspect. It has occurred to me, Korin said, not turning to face her. It occurred to me the moment their ship arrived, and refused every standard docking protocol this council has enforced for centuries. Confidence is not evidence of strength, Ambassador. It is, more often, evidence of ignorance. This species does not yet understand what it has chosen to defy. Or perhaps, Sela said, we do not yet understand what we have chosen to threaten. Vireth Sol raised her hand again, and the chamber's low tones sounded a second time, quieting the room enough for her to be heard clearly. This debate will continue, she said, but not through shouting across tiers. Envoy Hart, you have delivered your species' answer. The council will now deliberate on its response. You will remain in this chamber until that deliberation concludes. I felt, rather than saw, the shift in the room as guards along the chamber's outer wall straightened, weapons I had not noticed until that moment becoming suddenly, deliberately visible. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be. I don't think I will, I said. Vireth Sol's expression flickered, the first genuine surprise I had seen from her since I had entered the chamber. You are in no position to refuse. With respect, I said, I think I am. I raised my hand, just slightly, a gesture so small most of the chamber likely missed it entirely. But the guards nearest the platform did not miss it, and neither did the small device woven into the collar of my uniform, the one that had been transmitting a live feed of this entire exchange back to the ship holding position far above the planet's atmosphere. Somewhere overhead, in the cold silence between that world and the stars, the crew of the only human vessel in Council space received the signal they had been waiting for since the moment I stepped off the shuttle. The chamber around me did not yet know it, but the conversation happening on the floor was no longer the only one that mattered, and within the hour, every delegate in that room would understand exactly why I had never once looked afraid. I did not raise my voice. I did not reach for a weapon, because I carried none. I simply stood at the base of the platform, watching the guards along the chamber wall shift their stance, watching Vireth Sol's eyes narrow as she tried to decide whether the small gesture I had made was a threat, a bluff, or something she did not yet have a word for. Explain your meaning, she said. You told me I would remain in this chamber until the council concluded its deliberation, I said. I'm telling you that isn't going to happen. Not because I intend to fight my way out of this room, but because it was never necessary for me to be here for what happens next. A ripple of confusion moved through the nearest tiers. Corin Dassa's expression, which had settled into something like satisfaction after his call for a vote, shifted into open suspicion. "You arrived with no escort," he said slowly, as though working through the logic even as he spoke it aloud. "No fleet, a single ship, holding position above this world, its crew doing nothing but waiting." "Waiting for an answer," I said. "Same as you." "An answer to what question?" Virith Sol asked, and there was something new in her voice now, something that had not been there a moment before. "Caution. To whether this council intended to negotiate in good faith," I said, "or whether it intended to do exactly what your delegate there is already calling for. I told you my species refused your terms, because agreeing to them would not have bought us peace. I meant that as fact, not as a threat, but I also came prepared for the possibility that the council would hear a refusal and decide the only acceptable response was force. I did not come here hoping for that outcome. I came here having planned for it." Selatovan rose slowly from her seat, her four eyes moving between me and Corin, with an expression I could not fully read but that looked, more than anything, like dread. "What have you planned for, Envoy Hart?" I looked up at her, and for a moment, I let myself answer honestly, the way I had promised the officers on my ship I would, if it came to this. Every species in this chamber built its place in this council through negotiation, through treaty, through centuries of careful diplomacy, backed by fleets large enough that no one ever needed to test what they were capable of. My species didn't have 1,000 years to build that kind of reputation. We had less than 2 centuries, and we spent almost all of it fighting for survival against threats most of you never had to face on your own worlds. We didn't come to this table with treaties. We came with the only currency we had time to build. "And what currency is that?" Corin said, his voice low now, no longer booming across the chamber, but aimed directly at me, as though the answer mattered to him more than anything else being said in that room. "Capability," I said. "Not the kind you negotiate with, the kind you demonstrate." The chamber went very quiet. "You are describing a threat," Virith Sol said. "I'm describing a fact," I said. "There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one from where you're standing. A threat is something offered to change someone's behavior. I'm not trying to change your behavior. I already know what this council is likely to decide, because I've read your history the same way your intelligence officers spent the last several months trying to read ours. You've never once, in 1,000 years, let a refusal stand unanswered. I don't expect you to start today." "Then why come at all?" Sela asked, and for the first time, her voice carried something that was not quite anger, something closer to genuine confusion. "If you believed refusal would lead to conflict regardless of what was said in this chamber, why send an envoy? Why not simply withdraw and wait?" I considered the question longer than I had considered any other asked of me that day, because it deserved a real answer, and because I suspected that of everyone in that chamber, Selatovan was the one most likely to actually hear it. "Because my species believes in being honest before it believes in being safe," I said. "We could have ignored this summons. We could have stayed in our own systems and let you wonder, for as long as you wanted to wonder, what we were capable of, and whether it was worth finding out. But that isn't who we are. If this council was going to make a decision about our future, we wanted you to make it with full knowledge of who you were making it about. Not rumors, not intelligence reports assembled from a handful of border sightings. The truth, delivered by someone standing in front of you, refusing to blink." Corin Dassa let out something that might have been a laugh, sharp and humorless. "A noble sentiment. But sentiment does not stop a fleet, Envoy Hart. And your species has exactly 1 ship in council space." 1 ship, against the combined strength of a council that has maintained order across this galaxy for 1,000 years. If your intention was to demonstrate strength, I would suggest you have demonstrated the opposite. "You might be right," I said. "I suppose we're about to find out." Virith Sol studied me for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. Some calculation I could not fully follow, but that made her posture change, just slightly, from the rigid authority she had carried since I entered the chamber, to something more careful. "You said you did not come here hoping for conflict," she said. "I want to believe that is true. But I have led this council long enough to know that every species which has ever stood where you are standing, believed, in that moment, that its own strength was greater than what history had already proven about the cost of defying this body. I do not say that to threaten you. I say it because I do not wish for your species' first true encounter with the wider galaxy to be its last. For the first time since I had entered the chamber, I felt something in her words that was not calculation. It sounded, strange as it was to admit, almost like concern. I appreciate that, I said, and I meant it. But I think you're assuming something about us that isn't true. You're assuming we came here to prove we were the strongest species in this room. We didn't. We came here to tell you the truth about who we are, and to let you decide what to do with that truth. What happens next isn't up to us anymore. It's up to this council. Then let the council decide, Corin said, cutting through the moment before it could settle into anything softer. Guards, secure the envoy. Whatever this creature believes is waiting above this world, it will find that the council does not make its decisions under threat. Two of the armed guards along the chamber wall began to move, and I felt the tension in the room sharpen into something almost physical. 1,000 beings holding their breath at once, waiting to see whether the calm, unarmed creature at the base of the platform would resist, would fight, would finally show them something they recognized as fear. I did not move. You should check your sensors before you do that, I said quietly. Vireth Sol's eyes flicked toward one of her aides, a smaller being stationed near the edge of the platform, whose entire posture had gone rigid the moment the guards began to move. The aide was staring at something on a device I could not see, and whatever was on it made the color drain visibly from beneath her pale, translucent skin. "Speaker," the aide said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying in the sudden, terrible silence of the chamber. "The human vessel. It's no longer holding position." Every eye in that chamber turned upward, toward the vast domed ceiling of the hall, as though they expected to see straight through solid stone into the black of space above. "Where is it going?" Vireth Sol asked, and for the first time, I heard something in her voice that every species in that room would come to know intimately in the days that followed. I answered before the aide could. "Nowhere," I said. "It's exactly where it's always been. It just stopped pretending to be still." The aide's words spread through the chamber faster than any translator could carry them, passed from delegate to delegate, in whispers that grew louder with every repetition, until the hall was filled with a rising tide of voices that no single tone from Vireth Sol could quiet. I watched it happen the way a person watches weather change, from a distance that felt strange given that I was standing at the very center of the storm. Delegates who had spent the last hour calling for my immediate detainment were now on their feet, shouting questions at aides who had no answers to give them. Others sat frozen in their seats, staring at nothing, as though trying to reconcile the calm, unarmed creature in front of them with whatever their sensors were now reporting about the vessel above their world. Corin Dasa was the loudest among them, and also, I noted, the least willing to let the moment shake his certainty. "A single ship changing its flight pattern is not an act of war," he said, his voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority. "It is exactly the kind of theater I would expect from a species that understands it has no true strength to offer, only the appearance of it. Speaker, I renew my call for a vote. Immediate military response, authorized before this creature's bluff has time to unsettle cooler heads in this chamber." "Cooler heads!" Selatovan repeated, and there was an edge in her voice now that had not been there before. "Corin, you have spent the last hour insisting that a single unarmed envoy, standing alone in the center of this chamber, represents an existential threat requiring immediate military action. And now you tell this council that a single ship altering its position is theater, unworthy of the same caution. Which is it? Is this species dangerous, or is it not?" "It is dangerous precisely because it behaves as though it has nothing to fear from us," Corin said. "That confidence is either earned, or it is a mask. I do not intend to wait and discover which, while their ship maneuvers freely above a world under this council's protection." I said nothing while they argued. I had learned, in the years before I ever stood in that chamber, that there were moments when the most important thing a person could do was simply let others reveal themselves, and this was very clearly one of those moments. Every delegate arguing above me was, in their own way, telling the rest of the chamber exactly how they intended to vote, long before any formal count was called. Vireth Sol raised her hand a third time, and this time the tone that sounded through the chamber carried a harder edge. sharp enough that even the loudest voices fell silent, if only for a moment. "This council will not descend into chaos," she said, "not while a decision of this magnitude remains before us. Envoy Hart, I ask you directly, is the movement of your vessel intended as a hostile act against this world?" I met her eyes, and I answered as honestly as I had answered every question she had asked me since I walked through those 40-foot doors. "No," I said. "My ship has not fired on anything. It has not moved toward this world, this station, or any target within council space. It has simply stopped holding a fixed position, because holding still was never anything more than a courtesy extended while I delivered my species' answer. That courtesy is no longer necessary, because the answer has been delivered." "Then order it to resume that courtesy," Vireth Sol said, "as a gesture of good faith while this council deliberates." I considered the request for a long moment, because it was, I understood, a genuine attempt to de-escalate a situation that could very easily spiral beyond anyone's control, mine included. But I also understood something Vireth Sol did not yet fully grasp, something that no amount of diplomacy in that chamber was going to change. "I can't do that," I said. "Not because I don't respect the request, but because it isn't mine to give. That ship isn't waiting on my orders anymore. It's operating exactly the way it was always going to operate once this council's answer became clear, and right now, the only answer this council has given is a call from one of its senior delegates for immediate military action against my species. I don't control what happens next. You do. All of you, together, in this room." "That is not an answer," Corin snapped. "That is an evasion." "It's the truth," I said. "You want to know if my species is going to attack this world? We're not. You want to know if we're going to sit quietly while this council decides whether to attack us? We're not going to do that either. What happens next depends entirely on what this council decides to do in the next few minutes, and I would encourage every delegate in this room to think very carefully about what they're about to vote for, because I do not believe most of you understand what you would actually be choosing." "Then enlighten us," came a new voice, calm and measured, from a tier near the back of the chamber. I turned to find a delegate I had not yet heard speak, a being with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that seemed to hold more patience than anyone else in that room combined. I would later learn his name was Ambassador Doran Voss, representative of one of the oldest member species in the Assembly, and one of the few delegates whose silence up to that point had not been indifference, but observation. "Enlighten you how?" I asked. "You claim we do not understand what we would be choosing," Doran said. "Then tell this chamber plainly. What happens if the council votes to authorize force against your species today?" I looked around the room one more time. I looked at Corin Dassa, certain and unbending. I looked at Selatovan, watching me with something that had shifted, somewhere in the last several minutes, from suspicion into something closer to genuine dread. I looked at Vireth Sol, still composed, still measured, but no longer entirely certain of the ground beneath her. "If this council votes to authorize force," I said, "then somewhere above this world, a crew that has spent the better part of a year preparing for exactly that outcome will do what they were sent here to do, not out of anger, not out of a desire for conquest. Simply because they were told, before I ever stepped off that shuttle, that if diplomacy failed, the only alternative left would be to make certain this council understood, beyond any possible doubt, exactly what it would cost to treat my species the way it has treated every species that came before us." "That sounds very much like a threat," Corin said. "Call it whatever helps you sleep tonight," I said, and for the first time since entering the chamber, I allowed a small measure of weariness into my voice, because the truth was that none of this brought me any satisfaction. "I told you already, I didn't come here hoping for this. I came here because my species believes that even in a galaxy built on fear, the truth deserves to be spoken plainly, at least once, before anything else happens. I've spoken it. What this council chooses to do with it is no longer something I can control, and frankly, delegate, I don't think it's something you fully control either." "Explain that," Vireth Sol said quietly. "You've spent the last hour treating this as a vote," I said. "A formality, the same as every other vote this chamber has ever held, on the fate of some smaller, weaker species that had no choice but to accept whatever terms you decided to hand down. I'm telling you, as plainly as I know how, that this is not that kind of vote. Whatever you decide here today, my species will not simply accept it the way every species before us apparently has. And I think, somewhere beneath all of your certainty, Delegate Dasa, you already suspect that. I think that's exactly why you're so eager to vote, before anyone in this chamber has time to think too hard about it. Corin's jaw tightened, the plated scales along his neck flexing in a way that, even without understanding his physiology, I recognized as anger. You dare to accuse me of manipulating this council? I'm not accusing you of anything, I said. I'm just asking everyone in this room to notice how quickly you moved from outrage to a vote, without ever once asking why a species you know almost nothing about might have refused your terms. That's not caution, delegate. That's fear, dressed up as certainty, because fear is easier to act on than uncertainty ever is. The chamber fell into a silence unlike any that had come before it. Heavier, more uncertain, filled with the particular kind of quiet that settles over a room full of beings who have just been asked to consider, for the first time, that the story they had been telling themselves for the last hour might not be the whole truth. Vireth's soul looked out over the assembled delegates for a long moment before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice carried none of the confidence it had held when I first walked through those doors. The council will vote, she said. Not out of haste, and not out of fear, but because a decision of this weight cannot be left unresolved while a foreign vessel holds an uncertain position above a council world. Every delegate present will cast their voice. Let it be recorded, whatever the outcome, that this body deliberated before it acted. I watched the vote begin, delegate after delegate rising to declare their position, and I understood, with a certainty that settled into my chest like something cold and permanent, that no amount of honesty I had offered that chamber was going to change the outcome now taking shape around me. The voting took longer than I expected, not because the outcome was ever truly in doubt, but because so many delegates seemed to need the ritual of it, the formal declaration of a position they had already decided on, long before Vireth's soul called the chamber to order. One by one they rose, spoke a single word in their own language that the translation feed rendered simply as for or against, and sat back down, until the tally stood clear for the entire chamber to see. The vote passed. Not by a narrow margin, but by enough that even Selatovan, who had argued against it with more conviction than anyone else in that room, could not pretend the outcome was anything but decisive. The council had authorized what its official language called a corrective military action against the Terran vessel, and by extension, against my species as a whole. Corin Dasa did not gloat. I noted that, even in the moment, because it told me something about him that mattered more than his earlier certainty had. He simply nodded once, as though the vote had confirmed something he had never truly doubted, and turned to the ranking officer stationed near the chamber's lower entrance. Mobilize the reserve fleet, he said. I want every available vessel in position within the hour. You move quickly for a species that claims to value deliberation, I said. We deliberated, Corin said, turning back to me with an expression that held no malice, only the calm certainty of a being who believed, completely, that he was doing exactly what needed to be done to protect everything he had spent his life serving. The deliberation is finished. What remains now is simply the execution of this council's will. Vireth's soul rose from the platform, and for the first time since I had entered the chamber, she addressed me not as the presiding officer of a governing body, but as something closer to a single being speaking to another. Envoy Hart, she said, I would ask you, one final time, to reconsider. Order your vessel to withdraw from council space. Accept escort, under guard, while this council reviews the terms it has offered your species, terms that may yet be revised, given what has transpired here today. I do not say this because I believe your species weak. I say it because I have watched enough conflicts unfold across 1,000 years to know that once a fleet is mobilized, very few beings on either side of it retain the power to call it back. I understood, listening to her, that this was as close as Vireth's soul was ever going to come to genuine warmth, and I found myself wishing, in a way I had not expected, that circumstances had allowed this conversation to happen under entirely different terms. I appreciate that, I said, and I meant it fully. But I already told you this isn't mine to call back either. It stopped being mine to call back the moment your council voted to authorize force against my species. That decision was made in this chamber, not on my ship, and the consequences of it were never going to be something I could undo with a single order. Then you accept responsibility for what follows, Corin said. I accept that this council chose conflict over understanding, I said, after I stood here and told you, as plainly as I know how, exactly what that choice would cost. I don't think responsibility works quite the way you're describing it, delegate, but I also don't think you and I are going to agree on that today. The guards who had been ordered to secure me earlier now moved again, this time with clear authorization from Virith Sol herself, and I did not resist as they closed in around me. There was no purpose in resisting, not when the outcome of this moment had already been decided somewhere far beyond that chamber, in the cold silence of space above the world we all stood on.
You will remain in council custody,
Virith Sol said,
until this matter is resolved.
That's fine, I said, and I meant it, because I understood something the guards closing in around me did not yet grasp. My presence in that chamber, my safety, even my freedom, had never been the point of any of this. I had delivered the truth my species asked me to deliver. Everything that happened after that was always going to happen regardless of where I stood when it did. They led me from the chamber floor through a side corridor, away from the tiered seating and the arguing delegates, into a narrower hall, lined with the same pale stone as the great doors I had entered through hours earlier. The guard escorting me, the same tall insectoid being who had spoken to me before we entered the chamber, walked half a step behind me, her posture rigid, her faceted eyes fixed forward. You knew this would happen, she said quietly, once we were far enough from the chamber that the sound of the debate had faded into a distant murmur. I suspected it, I said. I didn't know it for certain until Corin Dasa opened his mouth. And you came anyway. I came because someone had to, I said, because the alternative was letting this council build an entire understanding of my species out of rumors and border sightings, and deciding our fate based on assumptions no one ever bothered to test. Whatever happens next, at least this council will know it happened with full knowledge of who we are, not some invented version of us built out of fear. She was quiet for a long moment as we walked, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its earlier formality. Do you believe your ship can survive what is coming? A single vessel, against the full mobilized strength of this council's reserve fleet? I thought about how to answer that honestly, because she had asked it not as an interrogator, but as someone genuinely trying to understand something she could not yet fully explain to herself. I believe, I said carefully, that this council is about to learn something about my species that no report, no border sighting, and no envoy standing in a chamber could ever have properly conveyed. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly how this ends, but I know the crew on that ship, and I know what they were sent here prepared to do, and I don't think fear is something any of them are feeling right now. We reached a small holding chamber near the edge of the council complex, its walls lined with some material I did not recognize, clearly designed to contain beings far more physically capable than I was. The guard opened the door and gestured for me to enter, and I did, without complaint, because there was nothing left to be gained by making this moment harder than it needed to be for either of us. For what it's worth, she said, before the door closed between us, I do not share Corin Dasa's certainty. I appreciate that, I said. I hope, for your sake and everyone else's in this system, that you're one of the ones who ends up being right. The door sealed with a quiet hiss, and I found myself alone in a small, dim room, listening to the faint hum of the council station's systems and, somewhere far beyond the walls around me, the beginning of a mobilization that would, within the hour, bring the full weight of a 1,000-year-old order into direct confrontation with a single human warship holding position exactly where it had always intended to be. I sat down against the far wall, closed my eyes, and waited, because there was nothing else left to do but trust the crew above me to do exactly what they had trained for, and hope that when this was finally over, the beings who had voted so quickly for conflict would understand, at last, why my species had never once considered surrender to be a genuine option. I do not know how much time passed while I sat in that small holding chamber, because there was no clock on the wall and no window to the sky, only the steady hum of the station's systems and the occasional distant vibration that I told myself at first, was simply the sound of a large facility going about its business. By the third or fourth vibration, I understood it was something else entirely. The door to my chamber opened without warning, and the insectoid guard who had escorted me there stood in the frame, her earlier composure completely gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded that I had not seen from any being in that council complex all day. "Come with me," she said. "Now." I did not ask questions. I followed her out into the corridor, where the calm, orderly atmosphere of the council station had given way to something closer to controlled panic. Beings moved past us in both directions, some carrying equipment, others simply moving with the particular urgency of people who have just realized the situation they believed they understood has changed beyond recognition. "What's happening?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Your ship," she said, not slowing her pace. "The reserve fleet reached intercept position 11 minutes ago. 23 vessels, positioned to surround and disable a single Terran ship before it could withdraw or cause further disruption." "And?" She stopped, just for a moment, and turned to look at me with an expression I could not fully name, somewhere between disbelief and something that bordered on fear. And it did not go the way Delegate Dassa promised the council it would. We reached a wide observation deck near the top of the station, its outer wall a single curved expanse of transparent material that looked out over the black of space and the pale curve of the world below. A cluster of council officials stood near the center of the deck, gathered around a series of floating display panels, their voices low and urgent, in a way that told me everything I needed to know before I even saw what the displays were showing. I stepped closer, and the guard did not stop me. The tactical display showed the positions of the mobilized fleet, 23 vessels of varying sizes, arranged in a formation clearly designed to surround and immobilize a single target. And at the center of that formation, marked by a small, steady indicator that had not moved from its original position, was my ship. Except the formation around it was no longer intact. "Explain this to me," came a sharp voice from behind the gathered officials, and I turned to see Corin Dassa pushing through the small crowd, his earlier certainty replaced by something far more brittle. "You told me this fleet was more than sufficient to disable a single vessel. Explain to me why 7 of our ships have gone dark." One of the officials, a smaller being hunched over a display panel, did not look up as she answered. "They have not gone dark, Delegate. They have been disabled. Precisely, deliberately, and without a single casualty reported among their crews." The words landed strangely in that room, and I understood, watching the confusion ripple across the gathered officials' faces, that this was not the outcome anyone had expected, in either direction. "Explain that," Corin said. "Disabled how?" "Targeted strikes to propulsion and weapons systems," the official said. "Nothing else. No hull breaches beyond what was necessary to disable the targeted systems. No loss of life reported from any of the 7 vessels. It is as though the ship is choosing, with complete precision, exactly what it wishes to destroy, and what it does not." I felt something in my chest ease slightly at those words. Not relief exactly, but a quiet confirmation of something I had known before I ever walked into that chamber. The crew above us had not been sent to conquer. They had been sent to demonstrate, as clearly and as carefully as possible, the exact space between what humanity was capable of and what humanity had chosen to do with that capability. 16 vessels remain, Corin said. Order them to close the formation. Overwhelm the target through sheer numbers if precision has failed us. Precision has not failed you, I said quietly, and every official on that deck turned to look at me, as though they had forgotten, in the chaos of the moment, that I was even there. It's succeeding exactly the way it was designed to. You mobilized 23 ships expecting to face a target that would either flee or fight back with everything it had. Instead, you're facing a crew that is choosing, deliberately, not to escalate beyond what's necessary to make its point. If you close that formation, delegate, I don't think you're going to like what happens next. And what would that be? Corin snapped. They'll stop showing you restraint, I said. The deck fell silent, save for the low murmur of the display panels and the distant hum of the station around us. Corin stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, the first genuine crack in the certainty he had carried since the moment I stepped into the council chamber. "Belay that order." Virith Sol's voice cut through the tension, and I turned to see her entering the observation deck, flanked by two of her aides, her earlier composure visibly strained but not yet broken. "I will not authorize an escalation based on pride, delegate, not when the cost of being wrong has already been demonstrated 7 times over. Speaker, if we withdraw now, every species watching this engagement will see it as capitulation," Corin said. "The precedent it sets will undermine 1,000 years of council authority." "The precedent has already been set," Virith Sol said, and there was a weight in her voice that silenced the room more effectively than any tone or gesture had managed all day. "It was set the moment 7 of our vessels were disabled without a single life lost, by a ship that could clearly have chosen a far more permanent outcome and did not. I do not know what that restraint means, delegate, but I know what it does not mean. It does not mean weakness." I watched the display panel as the remaining 16 ships held their position, none of them advancing, none of them retreating, the entire fleet suspended in a moment of uncertainty that mirrored, almost exactly, the uncertainty spreading across every face on that observation deck. "Open a channel to the Terran vessel," Virith Sol said. "I want to speak with whoever is in command." It took a few minutes for the connection to be established, minutes that stretched long and taut across that silent deck, until finally, one of the display panels shifted to show a face I recognized immediately, calm and steady, despite everything that had just happened around her. Lieutenant Olivia Grant, second in command of the vessel above us, looked out from the display with an expression that gave away nothing beyond quiet, professional patience. "This is Lieutenant Grant, acting commander," she said. "I understand you'd like to talk." "I am Virith Sol, Speaker of the Galactic Council," Virith Sol said. "Your vessel has disabled 7 ships belonging to this council's authorized fleet. I would like to understand your intentions before this engagement continues any further." "Our intentions haven't changed since before your fleet arrived," Olivia said. "We were sent to deliver an answer, and to make certain that answer was understood clearly. Your ships closed in with weapons active and intercept vectors locked. We responded in kind, but we chose restraint over destruction, because destruction was never the goal. If your remaining ships stand down and hold position, this engagement ends here, with no further losses on either side." "And if they do not stand down?" Virith Sol asked. Olivia's expression did not change, but something in her voice carried a quiet, absolute certainty that I recognized, because I had heard it before, in briefings held long before either of us ever expected to find ourselves in this exact moment. "Then we stop choosing restraint," she said. "That's not a threat, Speaker. It's just the truth. I'd rather you didn't make us prove it." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I found myself holding my breath, watching Virith Sol's face for some sign of what she intended to decide, watching Corin Dassa's jaw tighten with the visible effort of swallowing an order he clearly still wanted to give. Finally, Virith Sol turned to the officer overseeing the fleet's tactical coordination. "Order the remaining vessels to stand down," she said. "Full withdrawal to defensive positions. This engagement is concluded." The relief that moved through that observation deck was almost physical, a collective exhale from beings who had spent the last several minutes bracing for an outcome none of them were prepared to survive intact. I felt it too, though my relief was quieter, steadier, built not on surprise but on the simple confirmation of something I had believed the entire time. My species had never wanted this fight, but we had never once been unwilling to have it, either. The days that followed changed the way I understood the word history. I was released from council custody within hours of the fleet's withdrawal, not with an apology, exactly, but with something close enough to one that I chose not to press the point. Virith Sol met with me privately in a smaller chamber near the top of the station, away from the tiers and the platforms and the 1,000 watching eyes that had filled the great hall the day before. And for the first time since I had arrived on that world, our conversation felt less like a confrontation and more like two people trying honestly to understand each other. 7 ships disabled, she said, standing near the same curved window I had looked through during the engagement, watching the pale curve of the world below. No lives lost. Precision that our own tacticians are still struggling to fully explain. I have led this council for longer than most of its member species have existed, Envoy Heart, and I have never seen a demonstration quite like it. It wasn't meant to impress anyone, I said. It was meant to answer a question your council never thought to ask before it voted. And what question was that? Whether we were something to be feared or something to be understood, I said. You chose fear first. I think, if you're honest with yourself, you already suspect that was the wrong choice. Virith Soul did not answer immediately. She simply watched the world turn slowly beneath the station, her expression unreadable in a way that no longer felt unfamiliar to me, because I had spent enough time in that chamber to recognize it now as something closer to careful thought than cold authority. Word has already reached the other council worlds, she said eventually. News of this engagement traveled faster than I could have anticipated. Faster, I suspect, than your species intended it to. Every member of this assembly is now asking the same question I imagine you would like this entire galaxy to ask. If a single vessel, sent not as a show of force but as an escort for a single envoy, was capable of what we witnessed yesterday, what does the rest of your species' capability actually look like? I don't have an answer for you, I said honestly. That ship wasn't our strongest. It wasn't our newest. It was simply the vessel closest to council space when this summons was issued. Crewed by officers trained to handle exactly the kind of situation that unfolded yesterday. I won't pretend that was an accident, Speaker. My species has spent a long time preparing for the possibility that first contact with a body like this council might not go the way either of us would have preferred. But I also won't pretend that ship represents the full measure of what we are. It represents only what we were willing to show you, under exactly the circumstances that made showing it necessary. Something shifted in her expression at that. Something that looked, for just a moment, like the particular kind of unease that comes from realizing the ground beneath you is far less solid than you believed it to be that morning. Then I imagine, she said slowly, that this council has a great deal to reconsider. I imagine you do, I said. I'll tell you honestly, Speaker, my species didn't come here looking to conquer anyone, or to prove we belonged at the top of some hierarchy your council has spent 1,000 years maintaining. We came because you summoned us, and because we believed, and still believe, that the truth is worth more than the comfortable illusions this council has been trading in for a very long time. If there's a path forward from here, one built on actual understanding, instead of fear dressed up as order, we're willing to walk it. But it has to start with this council treating us as something worth understanding, not something worth controlling. Virith Soul was quiet for a long moment before she finally turned away from the window to face me fully. I will bring that message to the full assembly, she said. I cannot promise you every voice will agree. Delegate Dasa, I suspect, will spend a great deal of time in the coming weeks, insisting that yesterday's restraint was a singular event, not a pattern, and that this council's authority must still be reasserted through strength, rather than negotiation. There are others who will listen to him. There will be, I agreed. There always are. But I don't think Korin Dasa gets to decide this alone, and I don't think he gets to decide it quickly either. Not anymore. She studied me for a moment longer, and then, unexpectedly, something almost like a smile touched the edges of her expression, faint and careful, but genuine. No, she said, I don't believe he does. I left that station 3 days later, escorted not by guards this time, but by a small delegation that included Selatovan, who had insisted, against the objections of several of her colleagues, on personally seeing me off. As we walked toward the docking bay where a shuttle waited to carry me back up to the ship that had, in a single afternoon, rewritten every assumption this council had ever held about the limits of a single vessel, she asked me the question I suspected had been sitting with her since the observation deck. Do you believe this council will change, she said, or do you believe it will simply learn to be more careful about how it enforces the order it has always enforced? Honestly, I said, I think it depends on which of you ends up with the loudest voice in the room over the next few years. I think there are delegates in that assembly, like you, who understood something important the moment those 7 ships went dark without a single life lost. And I think there are delegates like Korin Dasa, who will spend a long time convincing themselves that yesterday was an aberration, rather than a warning. Which of you wins that argument isn't something my species gets to decide. It's something yours does. And if we choose wrong, she said, if the assembly decides, eventually, that yesterday's restraint should be tested again, more forcefully, by a larger fleet, I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered, because it deserved an honest answer, not a comfortable one. Then I hope, for everyone's sake, that whoever makes that decision remembers exactly how much restraint was shown yesterday, I said, and understands that restraint was a choice, not a limitation. We didn't hold back because we couldn't do more. We held back because we hoped this council would use the moment we gave you to actually listen. I'd like to believe that hope wasn't wasted, but I won't pretend the next choice belongs to us. Selatovan nodded slowly, and something in her expression told me she understood exactly what I meant, even if the full weight of it would take her people much longer to fully accept. The shuttle ride back to the ship was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over a person only after the adrenaline of a long, uncertain day has finally begun to fade. I found Lieutenant Grant waiting for me in the docking bay, along with Chief Engineer Marcus Webb, whose steady hands had, I would later learn, kept every one of those 7 disabling strikes precise enough to leave every crew member of those 7 vessels alive and unharmed. "Word's already spreading," Olivia said as I stepped aboard, the doors sealing quietly behind me. "Every council world within range of a relay station knows what happened here by now. I imagine there are a lot of very nervous conversations happening across a lot of very old alliances tonight." "I imagine there are," I said. "You think it worked?" she asked. "The whole point of coming here in the first place. You think they actually understood what we were trying to tell them?" I thought about Virith Soul's careful, uncertain expression as she watched her world turn slowly beneath that station. I thought about Selatovan's question, asked with genuine fear of an answer she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. I thought about Corin Das's jaw, tightening around an order he had wanted so badly to give, and had not, in the end, been allowed to. "I think some of them did," I said. "I think it's going to take the rest of them a lot longer to catch up, but I think, for the first time since this council was founded, every species in this galaxy is asking a question they've never had to ask before." "What question is that?" Marcus asked. I looked out through the viewport as the ship began its slow turn away from the world below, the council station shrinking behind us into a small, pale point against the dark. "Whether the order they've spent 1,000 years building was ever really strength at all," I said, "or just the absence of anyone willing to test it." Nobody answered that, because there was nothing left to say that the silence of the black beyond our hull didn't already say better. We had come to that chamber to deliver a single word, spoken plainly, without apology. And in the days and weeks that followed, as that word spread from world to world across a galaxy that had never once had to reckon with a species like ours, I understood that the chaos we had left behind in that council chamber was never going to be the end of the story. It was only ever going to be the beginning.